I'm not a designer, nor am I connected to graphic design in any special way. My job is to work on the fundamental issues in the study of language, thought, and writing. So I study the psychology, the linguistics, also a little bit the anthropology of writing systems and other graphic codes. So in my work, I've covered, as an academic, I've covered heraldry, cattle brands, numismatic designs, pictographs, and mostly writing systems. And I did a paper last year on the topic of ideography, which might be of interest to you, which basically asks what's the fundamental difference between ideography and writing proper, and why ideography seems to have so much less success compared to writing systems in the field of graphic communication. I'm going to try and make the case that may not be obvious to this audience, so feel free to push back, that there's a kind of supremacy of writing in graphic communication. When we zoom out and take a broad view of how people communicate with images, the writing takes the lion's share of that. And I try in the paper to explain why. I'm not going to have much time to explain the why part of the paper in this talk, but you can go to it and see for yourself how I do that. So the general question that I'm asking takes place inside a theoretical framework. Again, theory guy, I do that kind of stuff for a living. So I propose a general partition of all the ways we can communicate with each other, depending on the nature of the signals and how much codification goes into forming the signals. So the first big difference that I make is between signals that are transient or ephemeral, signals that disappear as soon as they're produced, and permanent marks. Obviously, in this conference, we're all much more interested in permanent marks than in transient signals. So transient stuff includes music, gesticulation, spoken language, sign languages as well. But we're interested in permanent marks, right? Modes of communication that leave a permanent mark in the environment so that you can see it. Oh, sorry, I'm checking the message board while I'm speaking, which may not be a good idea, but these red dots keep popping. So maybe I'm just not going to check them. And if you have some urgent question, raise your hand. And I'm completely open to people interrupting me. That's totally fine. So I'm making a difference between transient messages and permanent marks. Inside permanent marks and also inside transient marks, I'm drawing a very rigid boundary. Some may say too rigid, but I don't think so, between modes of communication that are codified and modes of communication that are not codified. So writing is a code in a very strict sense. In order to understand and use any writing system, you have to spend months, years learning a specific code, which is a map of correspondences between letters and sounds. In order to understand musical notation, which is another code, you also have to spend months, years learning a specific kind of code, which describes how the notes on the page correspond to tunes in the real world. Now, that is not the case for art forms or comic books and other kinds of visual arts. I do know that in several fields, including semiotics or the study of graphic designs, the boundary between those two may not always be obvious because you guys typically work at the intersection of those two things. And forms of communication like Neurath's isotype, for instance, easily blur the line between the two. But if we zoom out again and look at the whole gamut of means of communication that humans have at their disposal, I think it's pretty important to mark this distinction between codification and non-codification. Why do I think that? Well, that's the topic of the next slide. To illustrate my point, here's an experiment that was made a decade ago by a team of researchers that I was not included in. So it's a very simple task. It's a Pictionary task. So basically, you ask people to come over to your lab. Lab is a glorified name for just a room with people in it who do science. And you just ask them to play a game of Pictionary in an iterated way. So you repeat the game several times. So in this game, the participants had to communicate to each other. So you had typically one person who does the drawings and another person who guesses the meaning drawn in the picture. And there was a bunch of meanings they could communicate. One was Brad Pitt, another was opera, another was Bugs Bunny. And this slide shows you the drawings for Bugs Bunny. So in the first, you've all played Pictionary, I guess. So this won't come as much of a surprise to you. But in the first instance, the sender, the person who does the drawing, made a fairly elaborate picture of a rabbit and a man behind him, which would be the hunter in the Bugs Bunny cartoons. But then they got to play again and again and again and again. And as they kept playing, the symbol for Bugs Bunny became increasingly abstract and simplified. And at the end of the day, it was just a pair of bunny ears. And that was completely sufficient for the other person to guess the nature of the referent, in this case, Bugs Bunny. So to simplify, you could say that there was a before and an after codification. What happens in these 6 blocks of trials, so they played dozens of times together. What happens in these trials is that we went from a mode of communication that relies on pictures and then their iconic properties, the fact that pictures resemble their reference, to codified signals that are fairly arbitrary and just indicate a referent in a very simplified and fashion. Why do we say that this is a code? Well, it's a code because someone who is external to the experiment, who hasn't followed the story, would have a lot of issues identifying this as Bugs Bunny. And it's not just an intuition we have, this can be measured. And in the experiment, you can show that people who were part of the conversation since block 1 are way better at guessing the meaning of this than people who are not part of the conversation. And this is key, because this is what makes the difference between a code and something that is not coded. The fact that you need to learn the meaning of the symbol in interaction with others is key to the distinction between something that's just an image that you can recognize just in the way you would recognize any rabbit in the real world, and something that is a code. So codes matter. The bunny ear symbol differs from the symbol we had in the first block. One way in which it differs, which you designers probably spotted, is that the bunny ear symbol is graphically simpler. It takes less effort to trace, and it also takes less effort cognitively to process. It's also less informative to a naive observer. So a naive observer will have much more trouble recognizing Bugs Bunny from this than from this. And it's also relatively arbitrary. You can find many other ways to communicate the nature of the referent. You could use a stylus caret to indicate Bugs Bunny. You can use many other things. So graphic codes matter as codes. And they matter for human cultures in general because, well, for a bunch of reasons. But the most important ones, I think, is that first, they compress information. So with a code, you can communicate a lot more information with less effort, less material, less time. You can't do that as well without a code. Graphic communication that does not use a code is less compressed, and it cannot communicate as much information. The second code that codes do in the case of graphic codes, so graphic codes are codes that use permanent marks, the kind of things that we study here, is that they both compress information and they preserve it across time and space. So we have writing from ancient Egypt and from Sumer that we can read and that we can understand, and that allows the people who lived back then to compress information and to communicate it to people who were not alive when these messages were inscribed. The codes that are not graphics can't do this. So you can't do that with speech. You can't do that with gestures. You can't do that with sign language until radio phones, etc. But again, I'm taking the long view here. I'm interested in the long-term evolution of human communication. And so things like radio phones are not that important in the grand scheme of things for the things that I'm interested in. So graphic codes are useful. They also have this power of making communication asynchronous, meaning that you can write an email, send it to someone, and that someone can open it whenever they like, maybe 10 years from now if it got lost. They can archive it. They can do all sorts of things that you cannot do with speech because speech vanishes as soon as it is uttered. These are platitudes, but I'm dwelling on them a little bit thoroughly because, again, to stress the importance of codes versus non-codes, which tends to get lost in many debates over the nature of graphic communication and communication with images. Okay, so graphic codes matter, but in many human cultures, they don't, to cut a long story short. If you look at non-literate cultures, and I know that I'm horribly simplifying here, and the paper, which is fairly long, goes into way more detail and is more subtle, as it should be. But in many non-literate cultures, graphic codes don't do all the things they could in principle do. That is, they do not encode a lot of information in a compressed way that's accessible for future generation or for people far in time or in space. It doesn't mean that non-literate cultures do not use graphic codes. Of course, they do. And these are very sophisticated in their own way. But what they are not is self-sufficient. So what I mean by self-sufficient is a graphic code that you can use on its own. For instance, if I send Sue an email, actually, all our interactions Sue have been by email until now. We've never spoken together, and that's fine. I can understand you just by writing, and you can understand me just by writing. Even with zero context, without knowing who Sue was, I could understand her. That's self-sufficiency. The graphic codes that are used in non-literate societies, I will try to show, are not self-sufficient in that way. So the graphic codes that you and I use routinely are exceptions, and it took a long evolution to make them capable of carrying a lot of information in a self-sufficient way. That's my big question. That's what I study for a living. How graphic codes evolve? How did we get from a situation where our societies did not have powerful graphic codes that can encode a lot of information in a self-sufficient way to a point where we do? How did that happen? And in order to address that question, I address another question, which is, how do graphic codes fail to evolve? That's also interesting. We need to understand the ways in which writing evolved, the ways in which sophisticated numerical notations, for instance, evolve, but we also need to understand the kind of graphic codes that do not evolve. You probably know this story. It's a bit of a cliche, but I like it. It's the story of the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime. So it's a Sherlock Holmes story. Sherlock Holmes is talking to a detective. They're working on a case. The detective asks Sherlock Holmes, "Is there any other point to which you would wish to draw my attention?" And Holmes replies, "Yes, to the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime. Gregory, the dog did nothing in the nighttime." And Holmes, that was the curious incident. So the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime is the puzzle of something that could have happened, but did not. My dog in the nighttime incident is ideography. So I think a very general ideography could have arisen instead of writing, but it did not. Instead of ideography, we have writing, and I want to understand that. That is the puzzle of ideography of the title of the paper. So ideographs, just to get everyone on the same page, it's a fairly consensual idea in linguistics. This paper from 1940 is representative of a consensus that you have graphic signs, symbols, that refer directly to IDs by passing words. So these are symbols like recycle or 1, 2 or plus or minus that you could verbalize in any language. So English is not my native language. I can read this in French as recyclage or as en deux or as douze, which you cannot do if you don't speak French, but you can verbalize them in other languages that you know and I don't. So these symbols are ideographic in the strict sense that they directly encode IDs. There's a lot of misconceptions around ideography, which the paper tries to dispel a little bit, but this part is consensual in the literature. So an ideography now would be a system of communication that would be completely general purpose, that you could use to to express anything at all, and would be entirely based on ideograph. So you would be, of course, very familiar with the work of Bliss. So Bliss is one of probably the person who went the furthest in trying to build a perfectly general ideography. So if you believe George Bliss, the Bliss symbolic system is general purpose. You can use it to express anything, just like you can use speech to express anything. Another example that I like from fiction is the movie Arrival. So in the movie Arrival, these aliens arrive on Earth and they have two means of communication. They communicate with one another using sounds. They're like these giant octopi that float in the air, and they communicate with each other using sounds, just like we communicate using language. No real difference there. But they have a second system of communication that's completely different, which they use to communicate to each other and also with humans, which are made of this giant cloud of ink that you can see here, which have this elegant circular shape. I don't know who did the design for this, but it's brilliant. And each of the ink circles has a specific ideographic meaning. So there's an ink blot for human, there's an ink blot for the name of the main character in the movie, Costello. There's an ink blot for heptapod, which is the species of the alien. There's an ink blot for Earth, etc. And these symbols, importantly, they have absolutely nothing to do with the sounds that the octopi use when talking to each other. They're completely independent of the octopi's language. So they are ideographic in the proper sense. So ideography, they do seem theoretically possible, and many people have dreamt up ideographies. So many believe they exist, they could exist. Many have tried to build them. And there's lots of reasons why they could be attractive, and Sue's talk went over some of these reasons. Generalist ideography would be a complete system of ideographic symbols. It would not represent any spoken language. It would, quote unquote, overcome Babel. It would completely bypass the auditory modality, which is good for people who are deaf and mute. And it could also integrate lots of specialist ideographies for numbers, music, and so on. So it's an attractive proposition on paper, literally. And in fact, there are reasons to think that it could work. The reason for thinking that comes from the study of visual communication across language barriers. So linguists have documented a bunch, I'm saying a bunch, in fact, it's a few. There are not so many, and they are not extremely well documented, but we know enough to know that they did work and they did exist. So these visual codes are gestured codes that their users made use of when communicating across language barriers. Typical setting is, for instance, a monastery where A, you have a vow of silence, and B, monks come from all over the planet. So you can't really communicate. So you use these gestural languages to communicate. Another example is the so-called plain Indian sign language. It's kept this name even though the ethnonym has changed, documented by Mallory and other US anthropologists in the 19th century. Again, this was a system that American natives used to communicate with one another across language barriers. So you're an Iroquois, you're meeting a Sioux, you have no language in common, but you do have this system of gestures that you can use to communicate with one another. So you could call them visual pigeons. They exist, they serve real functions, but of course they are not graphic, right? They use gestures. Gestures are transient, they are not permanent marks. Ergo, they are not graphic codes. Now, what about graphic codes? Okay, this is the slide where I'm going to get into trouble with you guys probably, but I will, have arguments for this. I did the research on trying to teach these languages to people, and there's very little evidence that they work. So Bliss symbols, as you know, were originally meant as a generalist ideography. The only stable use that was found for them is to help children acquire literacy, children usually who have learning disabilities. And the studies that report teaching Bliss, they actually only teach a dozen compound symbols. And in fact, Bliss has thousands of compound symbols. I think 200 and some basic symbols and thousands of compounds. So I did a little bit of internet ethnography for this, and there's a lot of creativity in inventing generalist ideographies, and it's aesthetically very interesting and pleasant, and also intellectually admirable. What it is not is efficient at communicating. So this is one example at random. It's called the Western Ideography Project. It's a Reddit community that basically, so these are people who think Chinese is ideographic, and they want to do a Western equivalent of Chinese ideography. Doing a complete language, just like Bliss did for all sorts of things. So like here you have examples for geography, for body parts, for all sorts of stuff. And a typical problem in these communities is that A, people don't understand each other, so they communicate with strings of symbols, and they always have to give the gloss. Like it's not self-sufficient. And B, they don't even understand themselves. So they just, if you do not write down what you meant, you can't reread yourself and make sense to yourself. So this is a fairly common problem. So instead of generalist ideographies, we have writing. which we can use to express graphically anything we say. But writing is not ideographic. Writing is glottographic. And this is a big and frequent misconception about ideography, at least in the general public. The idea that you could have writing that's actually ideographic. So some people think this is the case with Chinese. It used to be an important part of people's theories about hieroglyphics. It's one of the reasons why it took so long to decipher hieroglyphs, because of this misconception. In fact, all major writing systems that make heavy use of symbols that encode phonemes or morphemes, not just words, not just concepts, but morphemes, which are the subparts of words. So for instance, the word unbreakable can be decomposed into the morphemes un, break, and able. And also phonemes, which are the lower level constituent sounds of words. And not just any morphemes or phonemes, but the phonemes and morphemes of a specific spoken language or a family of closely related languages. I don't have much time to argue, and it's quite sad because I'm going to sound very dogmatic, but in one word, this is true. And it's also true of your favorite counterexample. If you have one, just insert it here or ask the question and we can discuss that. I'm realizing I'm going way over time. So I just probably end with this slide, which should actually be the beginning. So the paper is out there for you to read if you're interested. And of course, I'm happy to answer any question, but there's a puzzle here. There's a puzzle of a dog that did not bark. We have writing systems. They are powerful. They're self-sufficient. They're generalist. They do everything we want of a graphic code. And it happens to be glottographic, always. There's no exception that I know of a powerful, generalist, self-sufficient graphic code that's used routinely by thousands of people on the planet, and that does not encode morphemes or phonemes or other parts of speech. So that's the puzzle. Why did humans not invent the kind of stuff Bliss invented? Why doesn't it work? As a researcher, I have theories, and I have two answers to this puzzle, one that I don't believe in, another that I believe in, and the paper examines them. And I will probably stop there because my time is up. Thank you for your attention.